Hey guys, it's Bang for Buck PC Gaming here. Just want to show you what you can build for yourself for 155 Great British Pounds if you know how to look. So I'm going to price up the parts and tell you what I've got for myself. So this is the MSI G41M-P25 motherboard. This is a Micro ATX socket 775 board. Above I've got the Intel Core 2 Quad Q6600 processor, quad core processor, one of the first quad cores for the desktop PC, and also this is all being powered by my Corsair AX860 power supply. Now this wasn't in a budget as I had this spare, but the equivalent power supply for this build would be a 600 watt. So next up is my CPU heatsink and memory. I went with the Cooler Master Hyper 103, very good budget orientated CPU cooler. Does a great job for the price, and it does support socket 775, which is something I needed for this build. Also for the memory I went with G.Skill High Performance 1333 MHz DDR3. This is going to be downclocked to 1066 as that's the maximum my motherboard and processor can support. Last but not least, the GPUs that I had in mind for the build. I initially went with the ATI HD 5870 1GB edition, but after some preliminary testing I found that 1GB of VRAM just wasn't adequate enough for a smooth experience, which led me to purchase the Zotac GeForce GTX 580 3GB edition just to give myself a bit more VRAM to play with. I did want to get the HD AMD 7950, but because of mining, the prices for these old cards are a lot more than what you would expect them to be, so this is the best I could afford. Now that I've got everything installed, I can finally show you how it looks before I boot this thing up, and I have to say it looks pretty good considering that most modern hardware is a lot more aesthetically pleasing. This does look okay. The Hyper 103 looks like a decent air cooler as well in terms of aesthetics, and the GTX 580 quite long, hanging over the Micro ATX motherboard, so not the most symmetrical build, but it will definitely do the job, that's for sure. So let's see how this thing looks when it's powered on. So here she is all powered up, looking pretty sharp I must say. And it's good to see everything's working, because when you buy pre-owned it doesn't always go according to plan. So the cooler I got for £16 brand new. The 8GB of DDR3 1333 MHz I got for £24, and the GTX 580 3GB edition I got for £50, with the motherboard for £20. So I did save a fair chunk of money on the graphics card, I have to say, because it is quite expensive. The power supply I had laying around, but you can get a 600 watt for £35 new, which will do the job in this build, and any case for 25 will do the job. So let's see what this thing can do. Before I go any further, I'm just going to quickly show you my configuration and setup. So I did opt to go for the Windows 7 Ultimate Edition 64-bit OS with 8GB of RAM installed on the Intel Core 2 Quad Q6600, 2.4 GHz at stock, but I've overclocked it to 2.91 GHz, all at 1.280 volts with a 9 multiplier. GTX 580 with 3GB of VRAM, all on drivers 388.59. Stock clocks are 772 MHz, but I've boosted it up to 804. Small boost, nothing special. And I've also opted to keep the memory at stock, because the Core 2 Quad 6600 has a hard time keeping up with the 580 anyway. So let's see if this old cheap machine can still do some gaming. So kicking things off with Crysis 3, just going to take you through the in-game settings. Used a resolution of 1920 by 1080 FXAA. Textures at very high, system spec at medium. You can see everything's at medium with anisotropic filtering 16 times, motion blur disabled and lens flares enabled. So Crysis 3, as we all know, a very demanding game. Even on some of today's hardware it will still push things a little bit. As you can see, the Q6600 is having a hard time, pretty much maxed out on all cores and starving the GTX 580 to a certain degree. But all that being said, it's still performing pretty smoothly, and you can definitely game on this system, for Crysis 3 anyway. With the ATI 5870 it really did struggle because of the 1GB VRAM limit, and it was a very stuttering mess, to be honest. I'm still surprised how well Crysis 3 looks even on medium settings, it has to be said. Just want to make you aware the benchmarks I'm presenting now are going to be a little bit higher than what you can see now due to the performance hit that I take from recording. So for the average frame rate, the GTX 580 did get an average frame rate of 73.8 frames per second and a minimum of 35. As you can see, there is a little bit of bottlenecking going on, so with a better processor maybe things would be even better. So moving on to Battlefield 4, just going to go through the in-game settings once more. So played at a resolution of 1920 by 1080 with the medium preset. Now this game still looks absolutely gorgeous even on the medium preset, it has to be said. So DICE really did do a great job. Again, all 4 cores almost maxed out, and as a result bottlenecking the GTX 580. But it's nice to see that we've got that extra VRAM available, because the 1GB VRAM limit would have been very close to being maxed out had I opted to use the ATI 5870. In terms of performance, this game averaged a frame rate of 63.7 frames per second, and as a minimum I got 42 frames per second, so not too bad. Minimums are pretty bad, that's due to the 580 being bottlenecked quite a bit, especially when things get intense. Next up is Counter-Strike Global Offensive. In-game settings, I used a resolution of 1920 by 1080 and the high preset. So let's see how this game performs. So as you can see guys, frame rate's a lot higher than the previous games, but the GTX 580 is suffering from a massive bottleneck due to the Intel Core 2 Quad Q6600 clearly not up to the task and not able to keep up with the GTX 580. Increasing the resolution may aid in this game because the GTX 580 definitely has a lot more left in the tank. Unfortunately the processor can't keep up with it, but gaming in the high 50s and 60s plus frames per second, so if you're someone who just likes you know, games that are not too demanding like League of Legends and CSGO, this kind of setup might be worth your while. So in terms of performance, I've got a frame rate of 69.4 average frames and a minimum frame rate of 41 frames per second, so not too bad. Moving on to Rise of the Tomb Raider now, I'm gonna heat things up a bit. This is a very demanding game even with today's hardware. So using a resolution again of 1920 by 1080 with FXAA as the anti-aliasing method. Graphics preset, I've actually opted to use the low preset as this is a very demanding game. Still looks pretty good even though it's at low. I do apologize for the choppy gameplay. It's very hard to record gameplay on this system as the CPU cores are already maxed out, as you can see. I did my best to try and get you guys some smooth as possible footage. Now this game is obviously tanking the CPU. Cores are screaming out for mercy, all 100% maxed out, and could really benefit from some hyperthreading right now as the GTX 580, although not bottlenecked as hard as CSGO, is still bottlenecked and would benefit from a faster CPU with a bit more headroom. So in terms of performance, Rise of the Tomb Raider, I got an average of 43.2 frames per second and a minimum of 27 frames per second, so playable, but definitely not the best. Now moving on to The Witcher 3. I had my reservations about trying this game, but I thought, what the hell, let's see how it does. So using a resolution of 1920 by 1080 and using a low preset, everything's at low in this game. Airworks is disabled of course, and in the post-processing everything is disabled as well, so pretty much as bad as the game's gonna look, but surprisingly the game still looks pretty good, which is testament to CD Projekt Red for producing such an awesome game. So not quite maxing out all CPU cores, but as you can see it all depends on what you're doing. When you're in a battle, things quickly change. And I mean, you do average around 40 frames, but you do get some sharp dip in performance, which kind of gives you quite a stuttery experience at times. But the game definitely is playable at this resolution, at these settings. So let me quickly take you through the performance benchmarks. I got an average frame rate of 36.6 frames per second and a minimum of 20 frames. So the game works well in spots. Some spots it works a lot better than some. So The Witcher 3, definitely playable, just on low settings if you're up for it. So final game, which is Project Cars 2, modern racing game using a resolution of 1920 by 1080, anisotropic filtering at 4 times, and all the rest of the settings are at low. So this game is quite demanding on the CPU core. As you can see, everything is at 100% load. I do have to apologize for the low resolution pictures. Again, because the CPU is on such load, I did have to sacrifice some quality in terms of capturing gameplay. But the game can definitely be played on this hardware, just you'll have to settle for around 30 frames per second on average. Things do start to increase once you start getting further out on your own, but when you're amongst loads of cars, then performance does take a hit. So for a modern racing game, it's nice to see that even this kind of system can still get it running. So let's talk performance. For my benchmark, I got an average frame rate of 45 frames per second and a minimum of 28 frames per second. As I said, I am recording this gameplay, so I do take a slight performance hit, so the performance figures will be a little higher than what you're seeing here. So there you have it, guys. This is what you can achieve with an ultra low cost build. Under 160 Great British pounds it cost me to put this together, and it can play games, especially games before 2013. It will have no problem playing those, but some of the older games it will have a little bit of trouble. You may have to compromise on settings, as you saw I did, but you can definitely get them running. Now I would say if you were a casual gamer, like into games like CSGO and League of Legends and Dota 2, then this is definitely a system that would save you a lot of money and still give you some great entertainment at 1080p. But if you wanted to future-proof things and spend a bit more money, then you may want to consider getting an FX 8350 or an Intel i5 2500K, just for that extra CPU grunt, which will help drive more powerful GPUs. So just want to shout out my Patreon supporters, my Patreon backers. Thanks for supporting me. You've obviously contributed to this video massively, and if you want to help out, link is in the description. That is pretty much it for me, guys. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and as always, thanks for watching.
The sky, we finna light it up. We ain't never coming down. See the people showing love. Say what's up when I'm around. They were saying it was love, but we see them in the crowd now. We too young to give a fuck. All we know is that for now, we young, what's up, what's up?